So please join me in welcoming them to MSU.
It's a delight to be here. I'm a big fan of MSU by reputation. Been here several times, never to give a talk, so I'm excited for this opportunity. Thank you for coming. This talk is, it grows out of another talk which I've given a few times before, which is part of this book that Dustin referred to, Making Religion Safe for Democracy. And there's a certain aspect of this talk which is focused on Hobbes that I've wanted to develop more fully. A few people had commented to me that there's some things that I have to say about the state of nature which they hadn't heard before, and I thought, okay, that sounds like that might be worth developing more. So this is my attempt to begin to develop that aspect. So I'm going to summarize, give a summary version of the earlier talk, and then pivot to some new material. But I'll let you keep track of when the pivot happens. The question of the talk that this grew out of, the guiding question, is what was Hobbes's ultimate goal regarding religion if his project worked fully? If everything went according to plan, what did he hope would be the situation regarding religion? And I see two main alternatives. The first alternative is a religious establishment of what I call Hobbesian Christianity. That is the interpretation of Christianity that he presents in his various works, most elaborately by far in Leviathan. The other alternative would be a more thoroughgoing popular secularism. In other words, a withering away of religion entirely, over time perhaps, but ultimately entirely, with in this view, the Hobbesian Christianity would be a preliminary stage on the way toward a more thoroughgoing secularism. So you could think of it as it's a question of how far Hobbes thought popular enlightenment could extend, as well as how he understood that enlightenment. So to start with what I think is the more obvious of the two alternatives, that is that his elaborate presentation of elaborate interpretation of Christianity is what, which itself is extremely ambitious, would be his goal. If he could achieve this ambitious interpretation of Christianity to make this widespread, this radically revised Christianity. So what characterizes this Christianity? Above all, a minimal theology, by which I mean as minimal supernatural doctrine as he could possibly muster. Minimal articles of faith. That is what he distinguishes as fundamental articles of faith as compared to accidental, that is not essential. The only fundamental belief of this version of Christianity is the belief that Jesus is the Christ. Beyond that, everything else is inessential. Even to the extent of what it means to say that Jesus is the Christ. That is also subject to interpretation and not to be insisted upon. Everything else in this interpretation of Christianity is in the realm of the uncertain, or rest on contradictory evidence coming out of Scripture, and being super rational is therefore unknowable. Perhaps the most important aspect of this Christianity is that the duty of a Christian wholly coincides with his account of the laws of nature, of which God is the author, and through which reason directs us to seek peace and instructs us on how to achieve peace. In short, Christianity requires adherence to Hobbes's political doctrine, including the basis and the extent of sovereign authority, and therefore Christianity affirms sovereign authority over religion, including worship, church structure, what's permissible doctrine, professions of faith, what these are, whether to have them or not, as the sovereign sees fit. Even if the sovereign determines that no religion should be established, even if the sovereign wants to establish idolatry, it is still, by this interpretation, a Christian's duty to adhere to this idolatry. His way of getting around the obvious difficulty of identifying this as a duty as a Christian is by impressing upon his reader that salvation depends on what one believes in one's heart, not what one does in action, including what one says. And he encourages, which is I think quite a clever argument, toleration of the sovereign. Sort of underappreciated notion of toleration. But there's a lot of questions about this teaching, including just how plausible this interpretation of Christianity is, particularly as we see, and I think Hobbes's audience who would typically have a pretty strong basis in Scripture and theological teaching, as we see Hobbes's highly selective, contorted, and distorted interpretations of Scripture. Often that seem to me to be forms of mockery. So just to take a couple of examples, are we really to believe, as Hobbes says, that the Bible teaches that the authority of Mosaic law comes not from God, but from the consent of the Hebrew people to not God's, but Moses' authority? Are we to believe that the abiding message of the prophets is to obey the sovereign in all things? Are we to believe that when Jesus said that his Spirit would descend upon his disciples, that he was referring to his breath? Because, of course, Jesus couldn't have believed in immaterial substances. Things like this. Now, it's possible that Hobbes anticipates this sort of objection with something like the following response. As absurd as perhaps some of these interpretations of Scripture might be, are they, Hobbes I think would suppose, any less absurd than the interpretation of Christianity that have predominated from time to time throughout history? Which people believe not because of their plausibility or rationality, but because simply they've been instructed to believe them by teachers, priests, parents, and so forth. And so if we institute a new education, starting from the universities and in seminaries and so forth and so on, then why is there any reason to believe that this interpretation couldn't gain purchase any more successfully than others that have come before it? And this would have the advantage of also encouraging peace and security, which people do actually want. It seems to me a more powerful reason to doubt that Hobbesian Christianity is meant as a serious proposal is that the argument supporting the sovereign's absolute authority over religion rest again and again in his account on the alleged unknowability of the truth in religious matters. So in other words, the argument repeatedly is something like, because these things are unknowable, therefore the sovereign must, in the interest of peace, have authority over what is religious doctrine, religious forms of worship, and profession of faith, and so forth. In other words, the argument for sovereign authority over religion rest on the radical questioning of all religious belief, including, therefore, the established Hobbesian Christianity, which would seem to make it somehow unnecessary. If people were prepared to accept it for this reason, why would they need to accept it at all? Add to this Hobbes' entire account of religion as such, the nature of religion, of prophecy, as dreams and visions, which are waking dreams, of miracles, and most important, the so-called seeds of religion, the origins of religion in human nature. These seeds are fear combined with ignorance of natural causation, including the natural causes of dreams and visions, which lead the imagination in Hobbes' account to run wild and invent all sorts of invisible powers. In short, religion ends up being, by Hobbes' account, identical to superstition, or as he puts it in one place, the difference between religion and superstition is whether the superstition is your own, and then you call that religion. Formed religion, what Hobbes calls formed religion, came about as certain ambitious charlatans saw an opportunity in the widespread superstition of those around him and formed these superstitions around laws for the sake of inducing obedience to themselves. And he claims that this is found in the first political foundings among all the Gentiles, that is, all the non-Christian Jewish peoples. Now, with this account of the seeds of religion in mind, let me turn to the most famous part of Hobbes' teaching, which, for convenience sake, I'm just going to call the doctrine, because it has two parts. The first part being the state of nature, the condition of equality, human equality, which meaning there's no authority, no government, all human beings are equally free, equally vulnerable to violent death, all have an equal right to do anything that they see necessary for their own security, an equal right to judge what's necessary for their own security, which results in the war of all against all. Radical insecurity and constant fear. There's no opportunity in the state of nature to cooperate or develop any of the things that we associate with civilized human life. A partial list of the things he mentions: no industry, no agriculture, no account of time, he mentions, no navigation of the earth, no arts and letters in the state of nature. So that's part one of the doctrine. Part two is the emergence out of the state of nature and the creation of the Commonwealth, political society, when a sufficient number of individuals in the state of nature come to recognize that the only way to preserve themselves is to agree mutually to surrender their unlimited rights and authorize a sovereign to govern over them through law, backed by power to direct their wills through fear. Hobbes prefers monarchy as the best form of sovereignty, but they can select whatever form of sovereign they see fit. Now, so these two parts together I'll refer to throughout the rest of the talk just as the doctrine. Just bear that in mind, the state of nature, and then individuals recognizing that this is unsustainable and a terrible condition. Their lives are at stake, and so they agree unanimously to form a sovereign and commonwealth. Now, this state of nature, as described, would be filled with fear and uncertainty, and lacking any of the features of civilized life: art, letters, technology of any but the most primitive sort. And therefore, it seems to me, it would necessarily also be filled with ignorance of natural causation, which requires a certain development of of the mind, of science. That is, it seems like the seeds of religion would be in the state of nature everywhere. And we would expect, therefore, the state of nature to be teeming with all sorts of superstition. But in none of Hobbes' account of the state of nature does he indicate any such thing. There's no indication of superstition, there's no indication of religion. Instead, the individuals in the state of nature are rational in Hobbes' sense. And I think, upon reflection, the reason for this omission, although it's puzzling in light of his doctrine of the origins of religion, the reason he has to omit it is obvious. That is, the doctrine, as I put it, depends on rational human beings assessing their situation clearly and implementing a feasible human solution. The establishment of a Commonwealth in a world teeming with superstition would more plausibly be what Hobbes describes in Leviathan, just prior to his account of state of nature, of what I referred to before, this shrewd and ambitious charlatan manipulating his neighbor's superstitions in order to establish law and authority around himself. So from this, I conclude that the doctrine is not seriously intended to be an account of the origins of political society, not as any sort of historical account, but is instead a sort of rationalist myth. So that's the summary of the relevant parts of the earlier paper. And it's this last part that I want to try to develop for the remainder of the talk, that is thinking about reflecting on the notion of this doctrine as rationalist myth. So from here on, this is this is new and perhaps a little rough. Okay. The formation of the Commonwealth, as described in the doctrine, is in fact one of two official accounts of the origins of sovereign power. It is, it is the one presented front and center in his major presentations of his teaching, the elements of law, the Chive, and Leviathan. And it's the one that everyone associates first and foremost with Hobbes, right? This is Hobbes 101. But there is also the often neglected sovereignty by acquisition. All right, so what I'm calling the doctrine is sovereignty by institution. The other is sovereignty by acquisition. So I want to consider these side by side, and I will take the liberty of focusing on his account in the elements of law, which is his first attempt to articulate his political teaching, that he repeats in basically the same form, at least in its essential features, in De Chive and Leviathan, all within roughly a 10-year span. In part 2 of Elements of Law, Hobbes says that there are two ways of erecting a body politic, as he calls it in that book. Quote, one by arbitrary institution of many men assembled together, which is like a creation out of nothing by human wit. The other is by compulsion, which is, as it were, a generation out of natural force. As in Leviathan and the Elements of Law, his main focus is sovereignty by institution, that is what I'm calling the doctrine. And the various other teachings regarding sovereign power and so forth that are attached to that account. Hobbes then, after laying out sovereignty by institution, divides his account of the other way of erecting a body politic, that is by acquisition, into two chapters. such that it could easily appear that there aren't two but three. In other words, I find it a little confusing initially why they're divided in the way that they are. It seems if these two additional forms of erecting sovereignty fall under the headings of, chapter 22 is called of the power of masters, chapter 23 is of the power of fathers, or of the patrimonial kingdom. The power of masters is the power over a servant or a slave, but the power over the servant is the more important for my purposes because it establishes the master's authority, that is the right to govern, based on the consent of the servant. It goes something like this: a captive is given a choice, death or service. The captive consents to service in exchange for life and protection. Then the captive becomes servant and has no freedom or property except what his master grants him, which is to say, all his property is really his master's. Then, next chapter, change chapters, on the authority of fathers over children. Servants are not children. But the basis of the father's authority over his children does not come from the fact that he is the father. Among other reasons, Hobbes mentions, who knows who the father is? Instead, the father's authority stems from his protection and preservation of the life of the child, who, receiving this protection, in effect promises obedience to the father, and thus consents to the implicitly contractual exchange of obedience for preservation. The basis of the father's authority is the same as the basis of the master's authority, and the extent of the authority is the same. Thus, what might have appeared to be two alternative ways of establishing authority, one over captives, one over offspring, are in fact one and the same. But we are not yet at the establishment of a so-called body politic, but only what Hobbes calls dominion of one human being over another. Nevertheless, dominion can be considered, as Hobbes says, a little kingdom or a little body politic. In other words, the principles of sovereign authority are the same as the principles of dominion. They differ only in size. The full-sized body politic, established through acquisition, which he calls patrimonial kingdom, is nothing but an expansion of the family with a view to growing the capacity to protect itself, where, quote, the father or master is sovereign, and the rest, both children and servants equally, subjects. Growing by multiplication of children by generation or adoption, or of servants by conquest or voluntary submission, to be so great and numerous as in probability it may protect itself. This is the patrimonial kingdom. Now, just as Hobbes collapses the distinction between the authority of the master and the authority of the father, so too he effectively collapses the distinction between the authority based on acquisition or compulsion and authority based on institution. Subject is to sovereign in the Commonwealth as child is to father, as captive turned servant is to master. As Hobbes says, as he puts it in Leviathan, the kind of dominion or sovereignty, here you see equating dominion to sovereignty, differs from sovereignty by institution, sovereignty by acquisition. This kind differs from sovereignty by institution only in this, that men who choose their sovereign do it for fear of one another and not of him whom they institute. But in this case, they subject themselves to him they are afraid of. In both cases, they do it out of fear. Returning to the elements of law, after the two chapters on sovereignty by acquisition, that is the so-called patrimonial kingdom, Hobbes returns to his framework of sovereignty by institution, which by my argument, that's meant to be his main front and center framework. This is the business about masters and servants and fathers and children, that is sovereignty by acquisition, is something of an aside. I think this is also part of the reason that it's neglected. I think it's intended by Hobbes to be seen as something of an aside. In my edition here of Elements of Law, the editor, who in general I think does a pretty decent job, inserts footnotes at the beginning of both of these chapters on masters and fathers to say this is purely of historical interest. This is not really essential to Hobbes's political theory. So I think that's a mistake, but it's understood. I think Hobbes sets up the editor to make that error. Okay, so he returns after treating the sovereignty by acquisition, the patrimonial kingdom. He returns to his main framework of sovereignty by institution, that is the doctrine, to consider the so-called incommodities, the inconveniences or disadvantages of several forms of government, in particular democracy, aristocracy, and kingship, the three essential types that may be instituted by those leaving the state of nature. His comparison between democracy, aristocracy, and kingship, he says, will omit several things. It will omit that the world, as it was created, I'm quoting, so also it is governed by one God Almighty. It will omit also that all the ancients have preferred monarchy before other governments, both in opinion, because they feigned a monarchical government amongst their gods, and also by custom, for that, in the most ancient times, all people were so governed. It will omit that paternal government, which is monarchy, that is so-called sovereignty by acquisition, was instituted in the beginning, from creation. And it will omit that other governments have proceeded from the dissolution of this form of government, caused by the rebellious nature of mankind, and be but pieces of broken monarchies cemented by human wit. By human wit, by the way, also the phrase that he had used to describe sovereignty by institution according to the doctrine. So, in other words, Hobbes says that he will omit, among other things, the fact that the first governments were all, in fact, patriarchal kingdoms, and that the other forms of government arose not from some institution out of nothing by equal human beings emerging out of the state of nature, but from the breakdown of patriarchal kingdoms. So, this detour in my talk through the sovereignty of acquisition helps to confirm the suspicion that the doctrine was conceived by Hobbes as a fiction, or a sort of myth. So let me take a closer look at some of the features of this myth with a view to seeing why he thought it useful to craft it. And again, I'll focus on the elements of law, which in this case does emphasize certain parts of the story told in the doctrine that are present in De Cive and Leviathan, but are relatively obscured there. The three forms of government from which individuals instituting sovereign power out of nothing in the state of nature can choose are, again, democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Hobbes has a strong preference for what is historically, as it turns out, the most primitive of the three, monarchy, while the worst of the three, in his view, is the one that is presumably the latest to appear, democracy. I make this assumption, I make this claim on the assumption that early aristocrats were minor patriarchs. But, according to his account of the erection of the body politic by institution, that is, again, the doctrine, quote, the first in order of time of these three sorts is democracy. In the elements of law version of the doctrine, democracy has a certain pride of place. According to Hobbes, the first sovereign in time must necessarily have been democracy because, quote, an aristocracy and a monarchy require nomination of persons agreed upon, which agreement is a great multitude of, in a great multitude of men, must consist of the major part. And where the votes of the major part involve votes of the rest, there is actually a democracy, unquote. Strictly speaking, then, individuals in the state of nature seeking to erect a body politic never institute aristocracy and monarchy. Aristocracy and monarchy, by institution, quote, proceedeth in the same manner, namely by a decree of the sovereign people, unquote. That is, from a democratic sovereign passing sovereignty to a small number of individuals or one. Once sovereignty is passed to an aristocracy or a monarchy, it is in the nature of sovereignty that it is passed entirely. No powers such as over succession or taxation can be kept in reserve by the people. This transfer of sovereignty may occur, he says, quote, when the particular members of the Commonwealth grow weary of attendance at public courts as dwelling far off, or are attentive to their private business, and withal displeased with the government of the people, unquote. All forms of government, then, by this account, by the doctrine, have at some point been officially approved by the people democratically. And, of course, it's the case that ultimately approved by 100% unanimity of the people emerging out of the state of nature. When Hobbes turns to assess the relative merits of the three forms of government, Hobbes is severely critical of democracy. Democracy, is the most prone to factionalism, and therefore the most unstable and the least able to serve the main ends of sovereignty, maintenance of peace. And besides, he adds, quote, in all democracies, though the right of sovereignty be in the assembly, which is virtually the whole body, yet the use thereof is always in one or a few particular men, and so much that a democracy is in effect no more than an aristocracy of orators, interrupted sometimes with the temporary monarchy of one orator, unquote. Nevertheless, by crafting this myth that asserts the democratic foundations of all sovereignty, the doctrine flatters democracy. That is, he's crafted this fiction in order to emphasize the democratic foundation. So, okay, in this context, I'll turn to look at Hobbes' teaching on equality, obviously related to his teaching on democracy. And his teaching on equality is similarly double-edged. He is, of course, a critic of, he can be seen as a critic of equality, a harsh critic of equality, despite teaching that human beings are by nature equal. The criticism is that natural equality among human beings in the state of nature leads to the war of all against all, the solution of which is an artificial inequality established under the Commonwealth. In De Cive, he says, all inequality is an artifact of the Commonwealth. So you say equality is the problem that needs to be solved by the establishment of the Commonwealth. All right, but again, I think the teaching is double-edged. So let me divide his teaching on equality into three parts. The first part of his argument is that we are equal bodily, by which he means not simply equal bodily, but we are equally vulnerable to violent death at the hands of others, whether by brute force or some secret conspiracy or teaming up or some such thing. The second part of his teaching is far more dubious. They claim that human beings are equal in knowledge, as he puts it, in elements of law, or faculties of mind, as he puts it in the line. The argument he makes in Leviathan for this sort of equality is very poor, despite the fact that he claims that on this basis he thinks people are even more equal in faculty of mind than they are in body. And I won't break it down in detail, but the nub of the argument, I think, is this. The proof that we are, in fact, equally wise is that we all think ourselves to be wise. Highly specious. And I would add, by the way, I've divided this into 3 parts. In the elements of law, he doesn't even bother to make that argument. He skips to what I'm calling the third, the third part of his teaching on equality. And that is this. The third part of his teaching on equality amounts to a concession that the second part is irrelevant. That is, even if it is a specious argument, it doesn't matter. Because if human beings are unequal in wisdom or virtue or other faculties of the mind, the fact is that there is no agreement about who is superior in these qualities, and everyone thinks himself fully capable of judging. And so, as he says in Elements of Law, in addition to this, and when there was any contention between the finer and coarser wits, so there is an equality in wits, however he understands that, as there hath often been in times of sedition and civil war, for the most part these latter, that is the coarser wits, carried away the victory. As long as men arrogate to themselves more honor than they give to others, it cannot be imagined how they can possibly live in peace. And consequently, we are to suppose that for the sake of peace, nature hath ordained this law, that every man acknowledge, and here I think acknowledge means something different from believe, acknowledge other for his equal. Equality is the law of nature. My translation is this. Peace between superiors and inferiors in the capacities of mind require the flattery of inferiors through the doctrine of equality. And this is because the superiors in capacities of mind are inferior in the decisive respect when push comes to shove. So, with this in mind, I think we can see that Hobbes' criticism of democracy is not as severe as it might have been. It's not as severe, I think, as the criticism of classical political philosophy, for example. Hobbes criticized democracy for being prone to factionalism. He does not criticize the majority for their ignorance or vices or inclination to let their passions overcome their reason, except maybe in allowing that democracy always turns into an aristocracy of orators. It's not that the majority is especially prone to unstable, to say nothing of unwise government. All human society, according to Hobbes, by nature is unstable. That is, the relevant qualities of human nature that lead to instability are shared by all equally, the many and the few. And so as participation in sovereignty expands, so too expands the inherent dangers, natural dangers of society. It's not the character of the majority, it's the character of society as such. To the extent that Hobbes does distinguish the inclinations of the few as compared to the many, it is to call them out for a willingness to disrupt an otherwise stable order for the sake of vainglory. That is, vainglory is the desire to feel that one is more powerful, superior to others, just because we enjoy that feeling. So this is, the problem is this. The few are, by this measure, less rational. It is by the most basic measure of self-preservation than the many. So, to come back around to the question of religion as the doctrine, and the doctrine as rationalist myth. The account of the majority as more rational than the few assumes that the many are not vulnerable to manipulation owing to their superstitions. And here we're reminded of Hobbes' account in Leviathan of the political origins of formed religion as ambitious charlatans shape religious fear of invisible powers into laws with a view to securing obedience to themselves. Originally, the ambitious few were not disruptors, but peacemakers. So I take this as evidence in support of the suggestion that Hobbes is looking for a more widespread enlightenment, at least in this respect. But this enlightenment has to be qualified because what he is arguing for is an enlightenment based on this rationalist myth rather than a theoretical education of the majority. And in the elements of law, he makes a very clear distinction between what he calls, uses a Latin term, but mathematical men, by which he doesn't simply or primarily even mean when we think of mathematics, but it's individuals who have a clear theoretical understanding of the truth for themselves, and what he calls dogmatic men who have opinions because they have been educated in a certain way and told a certain thing. And it seems to me that he maintains that there's going to be this distinction. The enlightenment of the majority is going to be of this dogmatic form as they have been taught this doctrine, the doctrine, with a view to reconciling them to the existing sovereign, with the myth that somehow they or their ancestors have voluntarily chosen and selected this through unanimous and democratic means. Finally, last word. Saying that this is a myth, identifying the doctrine as a myth, by saying that, I don't mean to suggest that it doesn't, for Hobbes, indicate a truth. I think any decent myth is meant to indicate some myth. Superstition, for Hobbes, I think, is artificial. Purely natural human beings are as described in the state of nature doctrine. Purely natural human beings are asocial, contentious, etc. The natural condition of natural human beings would be as he describes. So, ironically, it seems to me, Hobbes does seek to return, I'm not sure what the best way to put this is, to return human beings for the first time, so to speak, to the condition of the state of nature. That is, return them to a condition of, bring them to a condition of rationality for the first time. Not to the state of nature as a war of all against all. He clearly doesn't intend that. But in their minds, so as to clarify their essential relation to one another and open up the rational pathway to peace and preservation in the Commonwealth. All right, that's it. Please jump in anywhere. Yeah.
I want to begin with the last point because you kind of you lost me there at the end. I mean, the last part of your talk was very compressed, and
That's the part that I came up with at 4 a.m. this morning in the hotel. So in my defense, but yeah.
So it would be good for us to talk that through a little bit more fully. But I have in mind in particular the very last point, which is this your claim that that in some crucial respect, this myth, this rationalist myth, points to a truth. And I want you to maybe just clarify what you mean by that. It's never the case that humans are asocial, alone, and in pursuit only of their individual well-being as a kind of anthropological fact, but it's somehow the truth of the human condition. Is that what you mean by that? Because I took the preponderance of your talk to be suggesting that the account of free and equal individuals who in the forest get together and say, Eureka, we could have so many good things if we just got together and contracted and created a commonwealth, is neither true to how political communities form, nor really plausible on Hobbes' own terms.
Yes.
I mean, I took that to be the
Yes.
preponderance of your text. So,
Yep.
so then just maybe say a little bit more or elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by saying it's nevertheless true that this account of us as free and equal, vulnerable beings, preoccupied primarily with our bodily vulnerability. It's not anthropologically or historically true, but it's true about the human condition in some other respect?
No, I think that the aspects of human nature that you're describing are inherent unsociability, that we are naturally contentious, we are naturally interested primarily in our own well-being, and that's above all material well-being, and especially our own preservation, that is in fact anthropologically and historically true.
Okay.
But that in the actual historical fact, and even the fact in Hobbes' own day, is that this human nature has been shaped by myriad superstitions and other doctrines, confused beliefs that have been invented in order to bring about some version of social cohesion of one side or another. That's closer to the historical picture. But that, as it's turned out historically, and especially I think Hobbes is looking at in his own day, this has, at least in, let's say, modern times, we're not any longer in primitive times where of the superstitious, many will simply come under the sway of one individual. This is not, it is a radically unstable situation, and the only stable path is through enlightenment. And so he doesn't think there's ever been a time where human beings were in fact all rational and came and formed the Commonwealth, but he wants to make us rational through this teaching. And I guess I have to qualify rational in a very particular sense, because we're still under the sway of we're under the sway of a rational doctrine. All right, so maybe it's something of like what Plato Socrates calls true opinion or something like this, rather than knowers of the truth. And so, yeah, so the last point is to suggest that in a way, yes, the state of nature is the worst possible condition, and he wants to impress that upon us. But it's also the case that it's not quite the worst possible condition, because there's a pathway out of that condition to the stability of the Commonwealth. Worse than that would be a condition in which there were various competing superstitions being manipulated in different directions, leading to just civil war and conflict after one, and disruption and instability. So the pathway out is to bring people in a way to the state of nature in their minds, to this doctrine, so they can then next step understand sovereignty and achieve peace, something like that.
I'm gonna go for it. It seems like Hobbes, it was a very good presentation, but it seems like Hobbes reduces religion to just claims of political power. Do you think at any point throughout your reading of the work that he develops a satisfactory answer to the truth of God, or is he just indifferent, saying it's unknowable?
Yeah, that's a big question. If you mean to my satisfaction, I would say no.
Okay.
But I'm convinced that he was satisfied with his answer. That frankly, I think he was an atheist.
Yeah.
It would be a longer discussion exactly what his argument is to establish that. But I think central to that is a really radical and dogged insistence on the limitations of human knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah, the radical unknowability. And so the claims that enables us to see that, to be highly suspicious about those who claim to be wise about these things, and to suspect some ulterior motive behind these claims, something like that, which is where the political turn begins to come in.
Okay.
It's possible that this was present in your talk, and so maybe I'm just asking you to remind me of something that was there, but I'm curious, what is the connection between your argument that the state of nature doctrine is a rationalist myth to the question you raised at the beginning of the talk about the two alternatives concerning religion? I mean, does your argument?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Does your argument shed light on that question, and if so, what is the light that it sheds?
That's a good question, and I'm honestly still trying to sort that out. It makes me more inclined, I would say, to conclude that Hobbes is looking toward a thoroughgoing secularism. That is to the ultimate withering away, dying away of religion altogether, unless maybe there's just some form of rational religion where there's God as the author of the laws of nature, which doesn't necessarily have to be the Christian God or depend on Scripture in any way whatsoever. It makes me more inclined toward that view than I was before. My view before, I didn't go through the previous talk, and my conclusions, sorry to say, were somewhat unsatisfactory to myself, in that I had been just very uncertain, which led me to really wonder about the extent to which Hobbes had really even conceived the question clearly in his own mind. So now I'm inclined to think, but that he intended. He still thought that there was a limit to how rational, by the highest standard of theoretical, philosophic rationality, of the vast majority of people. The vast majority of people necessarily operate according to some doctrine that is coming from their point of view, higher authorities. But these higher authorities can, through this doctrine of the state of nature, now there's something new for them to that will shape their opinions. In fact, there's a passage from. This is the first time I've worked my way through the elements of law. By the way, I've spent a lot of time with the Leviathan. It's been very helpful to me to go through the elements of law. Not so much because his doctrine changes, but there are just certain formulations. One of which, let me see the page. What's almost here? This is very near the end of Elements of Law. And because opinions which are gotten by education and in length of time are made habitual, they cannot be taken away by force and upon the sudden. They must therefore be taken away also by time and education. And seeing the said opinions have proceeded from private and public teaching, and those teachers have received them from grounds and principles which they have learned in universities, from the doctrine of Aristotle, who he can't mention without punching throughout, and others who have delivered nothing concerning morality and policy demonstratively. Anyway, that's his jab at Aristotle and others for eloquent sophistry. There's no doubt if the true doctrine, now he does call it a doctrine here, but it's true, concerning the law of nature and the properties of body politic and the nature of law in general, were clearly set down and taught in universities, but that young men who come thither void of prejudice and whose minds are yet as white paper, capable of any instruction, would more easily receive the same and afterwards teach it to the people, both in books and otherwise, than they now do to the contrary. So that's my sense of the program. Is that this is still going to be dogmatism, but it's going to be a dogmatism rooted in the truth, guided by Hobbes the philosopher. And so far as I can see, it's what will remain is it's the part of Hobbes that's almost universally taught. I mean, who teaches the third and fourth parts of Leviathan? I mean, there are books and books and books written about Hobbes that make no reference to them, as if they're not there. And I think that would be fine with Hobbes. That would mean, that's a win. That's my sense. Yeah.
So I have a question somewhat related to Tobin's earlier. So it seems that your thesis about the rationalist myth, that it is a myth, the state of nature doctrine, and grows out of a puzzle. And the puzzle with which you began was you have this kind of psychology of religion.
Yeah.
The claim is that religion is to be understood as developing out of two things. On the one hand, fear, I assume especially fear of death. On the other hand, are ignorance of natural causes.
Yeah.
And out of that, you have superstition springs out. And then you see that, well, in the state of nature, there isn't superstition, and yet, of course, there's fear, and of course, there's ignorance of natural causation. And so how do you put these two things together? So that seems to be the puzzle with which you began, and I was just thinking about the psychology of religion. And it seems, in a way, fair to say, well, if that's an accurate psychology of religion, then it seems to follow that in the state of nature, people should be superstitious and religious. But it seems equally fair to say that if that's an adequate psychology of religion, everyone should be religious and superstitious. Because I would say, certainly my opinion, but even Hobbes, as I think you suggested in passing, thinks that the fear of death is a fundamental part of human nature generally, and our knowledge of natural causes is ultimately very limited. And so isn't it right, if that psychology is meant to give not merely an account of the conditions of religion, but actually the sufficient causes, then it would seem to follow that everyone should be superstitious, not just in the state of nature, but throughout. And of course, that can't be true.
Yeah, I think, well, look, I think this is, I think, one of the difficulties with Hobbes's account of religion in general, is that I think he does suppose that our understanding of natural causes is sufficient. And here, natural causation may be distinguished from our understanding of material substance, metaphysical understanding. That, I think, he claims is severely limited. But of just the facts of natural causation, and by the way, some of the most important aspects, and this is where he starts, elements of law, he doesn't start Achieve this way, but elements of law and Leviathan, both right out the gates, go in very quick steps to demonstrating the nature of dreams and visions. This is a particularly important, where do dreams come from, and what are visions? They're waking dreams. They come from all from the senses, and our imagination moves these things around and so forth. And I think the reason for that is clearly that he's targeting religion here, belief in prophecy and supernatural knowledge and so forth. And that it's people who aren't aware of how their minds work, where their ideas come from, and the causes of their thoughts, and therefore of their dreams, what their dreams are, and can easily mistake their visions for reality, will be easily deceive themselves, or you can manipulate other people's ignorance of these things to deceive them. He mentions in Leviathan people who are out after dark doing something they shouldn't be, and being, I guess, dressed as ghosts or something like that. You can take advantage of people's ignorance of these things. That by clarifying this from the ground up, we can begin to remove these fears.
But isn't there, I mean, that's to give Hobbes a lot of credit for the claim that's to say Hobbes thinks we can know a lot. In particular, that's to say Hobbes thinks that if somebody says God came to them in a dream,
Yeah.
Hobbes can disprove that, or thinks he can demonstrate that that didn't happen. And
Yeah.
that seems to
In
go
fact, yeah,
too far. I know he says, he's got this great line, right?
Right.
To say that God came to you in a dream is to say that you dreamed that God came to you. This is a very snide remark he makes, but it seems to me that he can't demonstrate that revelation didn't occur in that case. And I don't think, I mean, he might have been inconsistent on this, but in his best moments, I don't think he'd say that he can disprove that by reasoning from natural causes. So I think you would have to remain open to the possibility that God did come to someone in their dream, in which case, we all have to remain open to that possibility, and then given that we're also fearful of death, we all have to be superstitious if his psychology of religion is adequate.
Well, I guess two things. I sympathize with your criticism of his argument. I see no evidence for thinking that Hobbes himself thought that his argument was inadequate, or that he had to concede because of his acknowledgement of the limitations of human knowledge, that he would therefore have to concede that he didn't have a sufficient refutation of belief in the supernatural. In fact, on the contrary, I think that was the core of his refutation, of his perceived refutation of the supernatural, was precisely by emphasizing the limitations of our knowledge.
Well, so that's what I think, but then precisely on that basis, it seems one could say that to see the discrepancy between his account of psychology of religion and the state of nature, this puzzle from which you began,
Yeah.
one could chalk that discrepancy up to Hobbes's own shortcomings when it came to the psychology of religion. That is, Hobbes, of course, is reluctant to say that that religion has natural roots. And therefore, of course, he's not going to say that in the state of nature, people are superstitious, because that would be to say that, in a way, his whole teaching is anti-natural.
Yeah.
So the way I was thinking of that puzzle at the outset was that you can see that Hobbes, in a way, doesn't see the shortcomings of his own account of religion in psychologically, and can't abide by that account when he comes to the facts on the ground, the state of nature.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I would add to that, to my mind, one of the less plausible aspects of his attempt to refute religion is it's not just fear of death, but death itself. I mean, it's not just violent death; it's death. And Hobbes will frequently conflate the two, and he'll speak about fear of death. When you wonder, does he mean fear of violence? Well, he must mean fear of violent death. Because, I mean, one way to think about this is his account of the seeds of religion, why people turn to invisible powers in the first place, what they want these invisible powers to do for them, to make their lives secure, to help them prosper in life, to increase their fortunes in life. They're barking up the wrong tree, Hobbes says. We can secure these things reasonably well through the Commonwealth. In other words, it's a purely this worldly aim that he thinks those turning to invisible powers are looking toward. And so if we can establish peace and security that will allow for prosperity, then why would people turn to invisible powers in the first place? I think something like that is the formula for then anticipating religion withering away. But that doesn't, the Commonwealth can't solve the problem of death. And then there's second, I think that's the big one, but there's secondary things of just like the Commonwealth also can't solve the problem of illness,
Right.
Accidents, you know, cancer. I mean, things that lead many people to pray for help, because doctors can't help them, and so forth and so on. So even just on his own terms of worldly concerns, there are limitations. But so yeah, so I'm sympathetic with that. I do think he was optimistic. This is one of the strangely charming things about Hobbes is that he's a kind of a brutal realist and presents this harsh notion of life, and he's extraordinarily optimistic at the same time.
Isn't he optimistic, at least in part, and maybe even wholly, given the discussion you're just having, because he's a Baconian. In other words, his optimism comes ultimately from the promise of science, natural science and technology, and not, certainly not exclusively, from the promise of political science culminating in this Commonwealth. In other words, it seems to me that he is rationally optimistic, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
It's because he really does have the expectation that this new science will do what Bacon says it will do. And ultimately, that means, so that the real, you might say, the only possible solution to the problem of religion would be the human creation of immortality. So, as long as there isn't immortality, then it seems that there will be religion.
Did Bacon speculate about this?
Well,
I'm not a-
Bacon does speculate about the prolongation of life indefinitely. I mean, I would ask
Yeah.
my Bacon teacher over here, Mr. Craig, to talk about that a little bit.
But, Yes, Bacon definitely speculates about that, whether Bacon
Well, sorry,
actually was serious about
this, I guess this is
whether
what,
he
this
was-
is what
whether he
my real
was
question.
confident that the progress of the science that he was working on behalf of would ultimately be able to deliver on that. So I'm less certain about that. But I would want to just hear you elaborate a little bit on what is Hobbes' view about the naturalness of the human aspiration to immortality. Is it simply rooted in our anxiety about our own death, or and fear of violent death, or
Yeah, so let me just,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I want to, because your questions are related. So I strongly suspect that you're right, that he's a Baconian in the sense that you indicate. With regard to a technological solution to mortality, I don't see any evidence of that in Hobbes.
Yeah.
Maybe either, I haven't seen that. But yeah, he was Bacon's secretary, and apparently his favorite secretary, reportedly, because he was the one who actually would understand what Bacon was saying, and so be a faithful reporter of what was being dictated. And yeah, there are parts of I know in Leviathan, I'd have to think in the other works, but certainly in Leviathan, where it's clear what he wants from the Commonwealth is not just bare preservation of life, but an encouragement of productive sciences, of something like the Baconian model. Whether that would address, and I was going to say until you came to this point about immortality, whether that would address the fundamental problems that Dustin and I were just talking about, I don't see. It may help a lot. I mean, medicine has certainly advanced immeasurably in comparison to Hobbes' day, but people still regularly pray to God in hospitals.
They even pray to God in football stadiums.
They sure do. Yeah, other things beyond our control. So yeah, I agree. It just doesn't seem to me to really solve the
Well, just,
solve
can
the
I
problem.
jump in for a second?
Can I just?
No. No, it's on your question, okay, so it's all good. If memory serves, Hobbes doesn't talk a lot about medicine, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Now, so you would think that if he was going the Baconian route, that would be a primary emphasis. I mean, in Descartes, you say you have an explicit speculation that you can make my body as hard as diamonds. Doesn't sound very attractive, but anyway. So that, I don't know, that just seems to argue against the speculation you were pursuing.
And he nearly died, by the way, in the time that he was, sometime, I think between writing Elements of Law and De Cive and when he wrote Leviathan. He was gravely
Yeah, I was
ill.
actually gonna, can I follow up on your follow-up?
Please.
Because I was gonna suggest that, I mean, I think you're right, and it's a very powerful point, that Hobbes relies on something like a rational myth. And then we would have to distinguish between rational myths, irrational myths. There is something, say, bizarre about an enlightenment founded on a belief which in some way is false, even if in another way it's true. But it seems to me that, I mean, I don't know if you agree, but one possibility is that the whole Baconian project, as Bacon understood it, at its most optimistic, is itself a myth. And Bacon understood it to be. Again, I defer to my Baconian colleague over here. But there are other aspects of Hobbes that seem to be a myth, and if a rational myth. So, for example, the doctrine of, what Mansfield calls impartial government. the doctrine of representation. All of those are, I mean, I think at one point Mansfield refers to the doctrine of representation as a mirage. But
Yeah.
the thing that's most striking about that,
Yeah, I agree, that's
if
part
we-
of it,
If we, take it seriously, is that means that liberalism is a mirage. I mean, that the whole account of government that we sort of take for granted, whether we believe it to be true or whether we believe it to be just pragmatically necessary to embrace it, rests on a whole series of myths. In some cases, perhaps those myths can be shown to be rational in the way you claim Hobbes thought. He could show that teaching about the state of nature was rational. But in other ways, for example, the doctrine of representation, it's not clear to me that the doctrine of representation is anything but a myth. I mean, it's a kind of abstraction that isn't true.
But wouldn't it be, I mean, again, with this qualified sense of rational, in Hobbes' sense, it's a myth to serve a rational purpose, which is to say, and I think it's the same as emphasizing, I think it's the same as the state of nature myth, that is, the state of nature myth is hoping that we will believe that our sovereign, that we somehow consented, or our forefathers did, and that somehow amounts to us consenting to the sovereign, rather than his ancestors conquering our ancestors or something like that, which will reconcile us to the sovereign authority. And doesn't the notion of representation do the same? That when my sovereign is directing me and I am to obey, then in fact I am the author of that direction, so I'm obeying myself.
Yeah, no.
So that reconciles me to, and that
It
facilitates
reconciles
peace
you,
and is
but
therefore
also
rational.
It's also not true.
Right, right. But rational here for Hobbes is just meaning it's the smart thing to do to save your neck.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but what I'm asking is what I'm sort of moving towards is one, the question of whether you could give a truer account that would have the same rhetorical force, or is this the only account that could have the rhetorical force that one would need? So, for example, could you give a defense of liberalism that was not based on myths, rational or otherwise? And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the discovery that liberalism rests on a series of myths, rational or not, has the capacity to undermine faith in liberalism, especially if liberalism claims to be the truth about enlightenment. And so there is something, I mean, as I said at the beginning, there is something self-undermining about a doctrine which claims to be based on the truth, but must rely on things which are not true in order to. And isn't in a way, I mean, isn't that part of the problem we now face as good liberals, wondering why we should be good liberals?
Well,
I mean, the argument that Hobbes once made, and others have made, seems no longer to be persuasive, and certainly not persuasive in the way you would hope it would be persuasive. So.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, frankly, that I don't know that, I mean, I just don't know. I would just say I don't know. well, I don't think I have the capacity to supply that account of liberalism that you're asking for. I guess I would sort of retreat to my role as scholar to say that I do think Hobbes would push back at your account by saying that, let's say, Hobbes himself and those that he thought were philosophic, recognized the myths as myths. They too, and in fact maybe more so, saw clearly the reasons for obedience for sovereignty. In other words, Hobbes' own motivation to seek peace and respect, especially the monarchy and so forth, are entirely in place and compatible with his recognition that the doctrine he's crafting for those who are not capable of the thorough theoretical understanding that he has will need in order to reconcile them to what they need to do. So it's a doctrine for the majority. But I think Hobbes would think the knowers have sufficient motives on their own. But I still want to come back to your question about the desire for immortality. This is a real puzzle for me. Even though it seems implausible to me, intuitively, it does seem to me the case that Hobbes implicitly, I can't cite chapter and verse, implicitly denies that we do have a natural longing for immortality, or that it's weak, maybe can be stirred up by fictions. I don't know. I'm just, because I find it implausible, it's a little difficult for me to articulate what I think his view was. But I suspect it's that we are more, in general, our natures are more motivated by the negative than the positive, by fear rather than, by pain rather than pleasure, and so forth. And that the biggest concern that we have with regard to immortality isn't the desire for paradise, it's the fear of eternal torment. And that if that can be taken away, then that's really the key. And he seems to think, I guess he thinks that people can be reconciled to a natural death. They don't want to be taken from them prematurely, that's for sure. And certainly not in the hands of other people. But to live to a ripe old age of 90 or ever, old Hobbes to live ripe old age, in peace and prosperity, that we could deal with that.
Just a
yeah,
couple
I'm not
of Baconian points on this. The first would be to say, I mean, for Bacon was emphatic. Immortality is that towards which our nature most strongly inclines or most powerfully inclines. But he seemed to imagine that, to some extent, the destabilizing effects of our longing for immortality can be provided for in the right political order, whereby people can find, which we say, proxies for otherworldly immortality in the begetting and rearing of children and in the glory and honor of their fellow citizens in the service of either the community or humanity as such. So that's just a by the way point. I want to come back to another side of your argument, if I can, through another Baconian line, which is that learned times incline to atheism, Bacon says. So rustic times, people tend to be superstitious as learning diffuses more broadly through society. Those societies tend to become less religious. But then he says that deepening study leads one back to religion. So of course that's his, perhaps you want to say fig leaf, or his concession that what he's talking about here as far as the possibilities of popular enlightenment is not touching the ultimate question. But we're not interested in talking about pagan right now. The point is rather this. I don't think the Baconian connection is so much in the direction that Professor Zinman suggests, that Hobbes looks forward to the progress of technology and the provision of supports for our fragility or vulnerability. It's rather in the progress in our understanding of natural phenomenon, which Hobbes, I suspect, thinks will have the effect of making us feel much more at home in the world, right? We'll just feel like the world is not so wondrous, perplexing, and potentially ghost-inhabited as it would have seemed to someone unfamiliar with a kind of mechanistic science or science of the kind that Hobbes seems to have been committed to and even concerned to see advance, etc., and so on. Now, one could then look at your argument as suggesting, in the meantime, one must supply a rational myth whereby to create the conditions within which commodious living and the advancement of arts and letters and the diffusion of natural science can take place. And that's what I've come to do. I've come to provide the necessary framework within which the science can develop, then diffuse a kind of rationalist pseudoscientific analysis of the operations of nature that will disenchant the world to some extent and thereby work to suppress the seeds of religion and the deleterious effects of religion. Is that something that you see evidence for in the analysis? And I would just point to some of the passages that you cite, which I'm more familiar from the Leviathan than I am from Elements of Law of Kive, but where Hobbes goes on this interesting catalog of all the things you don't have in the state of nature, and it seems to be sort of like, wouldn't you like to have more of these? Right.
So sorry, it was a suggestion that this, what I'm describing as this mythical element of Hobbes' teaching is itself a stage to allow for scientific, other technological developments, which will have which will in themselves have a more rationalizing effect,
Yeah.
and therefore weaken the need for.
So in other words, this argument doesn't have to do all the work with respect to the fundamental, the $64 million question. It's one important part of a larger, civilizational project.
I'm not aware of. I don't see that, but I also haven't looked for it. Maybe the sort of thing that when I go looking for it, I'll note clues.
It seems to suggest a certain kind of modesty compatible with Hobbes.
I mean, I think I agree that he does want to clear the way for such advances, scientific, technological, and otherwise, with a view in large part to material prosperity and security. I mean, that really seems to me to be the key to human nature more than wisdom.
Just pursuing the same line of thinking. Since it does seem on the basis of the sort of arguments that Dustin was pushing, that it's hard to understand, as you yourself agree, how Hobbes could entertain the idea of a secularized world on the basis of his own psychology of the origin of it, given that we're not going to become immortal, and he doesn't even seem to be particularly interested in, diminishing, disease and the medicine route and so on. So so then the question is, what then could possibly be the root of the optimism that you see in his thinking, at least in those moments when you're suspecting that he does favor the elimination of religion, and that's a possible event. So another possibility then is to consider the possibility that he just thinks, as we've kind of been, as you were suggesting, that, well, death just doesn't have to be all that important to us. That it's violent, that all the emphasis on violent death could be implicitly an argument saying everything that everybody always said about the importance of death is really rooted in violent death, the fear of violent death. And that's something we can't get used to or accept. And as long as the world is full of violent death, then religion is inevitable. But if you could take out the violent element, death, maybe his optimism is that, yeah, we can be okay with death, which is, I think, what you were suggesting. Yeah. But then you're saying that Bacon was very impressed with, a longing for immortality. So the first question would be, is fear of death and longing for immortality the same thing? I mean, maybe. I don't have a settled opinion on this. Or are they two different things? I mean, it could be that the only reason why you're afraid of death is that you want life. Or it could be that you want life because you're so afraid of annihilation, of death. So, I can imagine them being different. So I guess the first concrete question is just, does Hobbes, he obviously talks all the time about death, does he talk about the longing for immortality? Is that?
So far as I'm aware, only in the context of his accounts of Christian doctrine, which it's his business to dismantle.
Okay. And then turning to Bacon. So there is this essay where he talks about fear of death and saying, oh, that's overblown. People don't think about death very much. They think that they're afraid of ingrown toenail more than death. So then how does that fit into your characterization of what you just were saying earlier about Bacon being very much concerned with death and immortality?
Well, yeah, I think...
Is he just joking? Or?
Well, I don't want to detract too much from talking about Bacon instead of talking about Hobbes. The essay that you refer to, men fear death like children fear going into the dark, and the suggestion is that with a little time and acclimatizing yourself to it, it ceases to be. I think the more you read that essay, the more you see that, in fact, Bacon's actually cataloging a whole bunch of ways in which concern with our mortality resurfaces despite our best efforts to suppress it and ignore it. So that would be a short answer on that. The essays are very difficult to interpret, and they lend themselves to a variety of interpretations. That's how I would reconcile the claim in The Advancement of Learning that immortality is that which our nature doth most incline towards, with apparent diminution and Lucretian analysis of death in the second essay.
Yeah, so just to throw a little Rousseau in the mix. So it is a thesis repeated on more than one occasion in Rousseau that the fear of death, well, it wasn't there in the state of nature, but that's because we had no reason, and so no foresight, and so we could no more fear death in the way that we do now than an animal can fear death. But he does also say that it's less natural than people suppose.
What's
The fear of death is less natural or less powerful than people suppose. That it's, I mean, his constant, reiterated fundamental thesis that most of the evils of human life that we're supposed to be inherent in our nature is really due to society. And one version of that, one aspect, a piece of that, is that he does argue that it's, it's doctors who fill us with fears, and it's priests who fill us with fears, and even philosophers, he says, fill us with fears, and that if it weren't for their influence, we would die much more easily. That the fear is less strong. So it could be that Hobbes is of some view like that. That would
Yeah, I
be a
don't know about
grounding
his
for-
view on medicine, but I'm just not aware anywhere he talks about it.
Yeah.
But I suspect that it's somewhat close to that with regard to where the fear of death and even the longing for immortality comes from. It comes from imaginings that have been largely fed to us by other sources. Yeah.
So, sorry, but like life itself,
Yeah.
lectures on Hobbes must also terminate. So let's next week. No, someone do it. Thank you.